Welcome back. In this lecture, we will look at the Bush-Clinton years, focusing on kind of political history because it impacts the rest of the nation. So I'll try not to take too long. It's hopefully fairly short, but I will interject my own personal experience because I grew up in the 1990s and I remember a lot of this. I was a teenager by then, and even back then, we only got like 3 channels, so I would always watch the national news along with the local news because that's all we had on TV. We couldn't afford cable. And so I remember a lot of this stuff and even watch things like the debates and so forth. And so I'll interject with a few examples from what I can recall in the 1990s. So these are the objectives. Number one, we're going to address a generational shift in politics. So we will see how today it's we kind of mock, we call somebody a boomer as though it's some kind of joke calling somebody old. But in the 1990s, it was a major shift to go from somebody who grew up in the Depression, who tended to dominate politics, right? Most of the politicians tended to come from that generation of World War II or prior to that. And a new generation that was coming into its own, reflected by Clinton, which were the baby boomers, right? Grew up during the civil rights. And people hoping that they can make America a better place due to that experience. Number two, we're going to explain Clinton's policies and the impact of the American communities. So, like any president, right, they have some positive qualities, but a lot of negative. So we'll address those issues too, and the way his policies impacted, particularly working class people, people who probably need more help than the upper echelons of the population. So we begin by looking at the Bush years. So the legacy of Ronald Reagan is one that is cemented in lore, particularly because he spoke the language of Goldwater. And this will be key because Goldwater kind of sets the tone for future presidents, and we will see this even with Bill Clinton. So words like, quote, big government, liberals, taxes, deficit spending, unquote, especially for those receiving public assistance, were now considered anti-American. And we see this today, right? People that receive welfare are stigmatized, whereas corporations that receive welfare are lauded. The Reagan Revolution triumphed by creating a division of the haves versus the have-nots. Reagan, quote, lowered taxes for the wealthy and permanently curtailed the growth of the welfare state, unquote. However, the New Deal and the Great Society standing as Americans still expected, quote, the federal government to pay pensions, guarantee unemployment benefits, curb pollution, and help poor children, unquote. After this revolution, George Bush won the presidency following the Republican playbook of linking his opponent, Michael Dukakis, to high taxes, calling him the governor of Taxachusetts, and labeled him soft on crime by, quote, tapping into white fears and mentioning Willie Horton, an African-American prisoner who took part of a weekend furlough program in Massachusetts and raped a white woman, unquote. So this is a commercial that was playing over and over. And again, this is something that we see in politics today, right? Dirty, negative commercials that people hate, but they work, right? And it really took off during this election. The irony was that Bush defined Dukakis as someone that would raise taxes and let criminals out of jail, right? The Democratic Party was too fragmented throughout the late 1980s, and it could not muster up any core issues that resonated with voters. So Bush easily won with 54% of the popular vote and received 426 delegates compared to the 112 of Dukakis. So with the gap between the rich and the poor growing, we must come back to the topic of deindustrialization. You might not be aware, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and we can even go as far back as 1840s, the U.S. sought to create a, quote, open door, unquote, policy in order to pry open the Chinese market so it can sell American goods to the Chinese. The irony was that by the 1990s, American companies increasingly outsourced manufacturing jobs to China, helping China, quote, bolster the autocratic communist regime and possibly replacing the U.S. as the world's strongest power, unquote. So if you watch Shark Tank, what's his name? O'Leary, he always talks about in that show, when people are producing things in America, he's like, make it in China, it's cheaper, it makes you more money, and so forth. And it's so funny because he kind of changed his tune in the last couple of years. Since the U.S. was importing more goods than exporting, adding to jobs leaving, the U.S. entered a recession in 1991. And I still recall in the early 90s when Tom Brokaw did a news segment on Levi's. And he was talking about how this American product that defined America and the West was leaving the United States to being produced in some other part of the world. I think it was China at that time. So Bush's 1988 promise of quote unquote, read my lips, no new taxes, fell to the wayside due to a ballooning deficit, which was a result of Reagan's increased defense spending, increasing interest rates due to rising inflation in the late 80s, and the bailing out of the banks, along with paying for an Iraq war, caused the economy to tumble and forced Bush to agree to tax hikes, which politically are unpopular, but economically they are necessary. And if you look at our deficit, you probably understand that taxes have to be raised at some point, right, to pay that huge deficit. Had the election been held in 1991, Bush would have easily won due to his popularity during the Gulf War. I think his popularity was close to like 90%. However, in 1992, Americans still felt the impact of the recession. In addition, Ross Perot entered the election as a competitive third-party candidate who focused on the ever-increasing national debt. He was actually allowed to join the debate, unheard of in most political debates, presidential debates at the time. He would take and he would host a 30-minute television commercial block using his own money, because he was filthy rich, to kind of fund his campaign. And he would explain the economic cliff the U.S. was heading towards, and was somewhat successful by garnishing 19% of the popular vote, impacting Bush's voting bloc. Bush, for his part, came off as out of touch along with the GOP. When Pat Buchanan, a right-wing populist, gave his speech at the GOP National Convention, it seemed to reflect an era that no longer existed, as he declared a quote-unquote culture war against, quote, feminists, abortion right advocates, and gay lesbian rights advocates, unquote, and seemed out of touch with the 1990s MTV generation that was more tolerant of these topics. Bush, who was part of the WW2 generation, seemed out of place, as Bill Clinton, a baby boomer, was charismatic and reflected the struggling economic reality, as many saw him as a quote-unquote guy next door who struggled like the rest of us, reflecting a working class ethos. He came off as a genuinely empathetic, often working to, quote, prevent confrontation and please as many diverse and often conflicting interests as possible, unquote. In fact, he changed the political process by going to talk shows such as the Arsenio Hall Show and playing the saxophone with the band and talking about his past drug use or lack thereof. He had an affinity for fast food such as McDonald's and was even called, quote, unquote, the first black president, partly because he, quote, made good on his pledge to diversify the upper echelons of the executive branch by selecting women and minority candidates, unquote. Though this, would be highly debated whether he was the first black president. So I don't want to spend too much time on Clinton, but I do want to address some of his policies, which had a long-term impact. So before I get into those, though, I feel kind of obligated to talk about his scandals because there were quite a few. But he was able to walk away from them without too much of a political hit. So first, the Whitewater scandal, which dealt with real estate back when Clinton was the Attorney General in Arkansas, opened the door to the infamous Lewinsky affair. So this affair had a far-reaching impact, as it not only caused him to be impeached by the House, but it also entered popular culture to shift the definition of what constituted sex for a new generation. The investigation was detailed, almost pornographic, and though Clinton was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice, for the most part, most Americans saw it as, quote, a juvenile escapade because polls suggested that the obsession of Ken Starr and members of Congress with Clinton's sexual acts appalled Americans far more than the president's irresponsible behavior. Clinton's popularity throughout his impeachment controversy demonstrated how profoundly traditional attitudes toward sexual morality had changed, unquote. So in fact, studies in the 2000s show that only 20% of students considered oral sex to be sex, particularly amongst young adults. So you see a major generational shift happen here. As I mentioned earlier, right? Clinton represents that shift. So in other words, American culture was becoming more liberal when it came to our understanding of sex. And Clinton did help lead the change as the stigma never negatively impacted him. However, Monica Lewinsky's fate was quite different, right? And, in the last couple of years, society as a whole has kind of come to her defense. So as much as a Teflon president as he was, the reality is that the state of the economy was always shaped by elections and our view of politicians. By the spring of 1993, the recession was essentially over. However, unemployment hovered around 7%, with corporations looking to cut labor costs by either laying off workers and mid-level management and replace them with computer-driven machines. I mean, it sounds reminiscent of what's happening today with AI. By the late 1990s, only 12% of the workforce were union members. Remember, unions built the middle class. Those that did worked harder and longer, showing that productivity increased 55%, while their wages dropped 8% between the year of 1973 to 2005. Clinton's policies did not help them, and yes, he did raise taxes on the wealthy from 31% to 36% and significantly expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit, which benefited low-income workers. But the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, known as NAFTA, which created a free trade zone consisting of Canada, Mexico, and the US, sent thousands of jobs across the border. In addition, he reduced trade barriers with major Pacific Rim nations, which kept the US economy humming well into the dot-com bust. This allowed him to balance the federal budget and even provided a surplus, the last president to do so in modern history. With the Republicans winning the midterms, Clinton tried to find the middle ground in order to win re-election. The contract with America that Republicans pushed promised to end quote-unquote big government by cutting taxes, eliminate economic and environmental regulations, overhaul the welfare system, and end programs from the civil rights era. This pushed Clinton to the middle, and he opposed the most extreme parts of the Republican agenda, but embraced the quote-unquote anti-government outlook, such as signing into law, quote, a Republican bill that abolished the program of aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, which was also known as welfare, unquote. Though welfare did decline because less people were eligible, the number of children that needed it amounted around 9 million. So now people were, quote, required to find work and be off the welfare system within 2 years, and it restricted eligibility to 5 years during the person's lifetime. And most studies have shown that most people that are on welfare are typically on it for about 2 years. Though I'm sure many of you probably know people that have been on it longer. The reality, statistically speaking, has always been 2 years. His don't ask, don't tell policy for gay military service people allowed them to serve, but restricted their acknowledgement and had to continue to be in hiding, basically, right, in the closet. With Clinton seeking the suburban vote, particularly the soccer moms, he championed the Defense of Marriage Act of 1996 that, quote, defined marriage as a union between a man and a woman, unquote, which set back the gay movement for equality. After the Los Angeles riots of the early 1990s, Americans felt that crime was rampant, particularly in certain communities. Remember, a lot of people are living in the suburbs now, and they look at the inner cities, which they perceive mostly being of brown people, as just crime-ridden centers. So, fueled by deindustrialization, right, manufacturing job loss, the rise of gangs and crack cocaine use, crime became an easy exploitable issue to campaign around. Law and order is something that we typically hear around the election cycle, and by the 1990s, Americans already agreed with notions of black pathology, where African communities were seen as centers of criminal activity. In 1994, Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Enforcement Act, designed to alleviate the problem of crime in the inner cities, providing more community policing, more officers on the streets, and more money for drug courts and prisons, unquote. States implemented 3 strikes, you're out laws. And I remember this in California, they had this. So a lot of people who, maybe committed a major crime at the beginning, drug crime basically, and then committed 2 minor ones later were put in prison for life due to this law. So drug users were imprisoned for possessing even small amount of drugs. And though the crime rate decreased, the amount of people in prison exploded. The prison industrial complex emerged as we saw between 1990 to 1995. The federal government and states built 200 new prisons, spending more on prisons than on higher education. Convict labor, basically some kind of slave system, re-emerged from the ashes with private corporate prison companies, quote unquote, lease prisoners. And one study in 2000 noted that there were 80,000 inmates in the U.S. employed in commercial activity, some earning as little as 21 cents an hour. The U.S. government program, Federal Prison Industries, currently employs 21,000 inmates, an increase of 14% in the last 2 years alone. This is a study from the 2000s. So typically when you would call to make a reservation for your flight, more than likely you were contacting a prisoner who was paying, getting paid these salaries. So as you can see, it was profitable for businesses to increase incarcerations. In fact, a midnight basketball program was originally included in this bill as it was a pilot program that demonstrated that black youth basketball leagues allowed them to stay out of trouble. The cost was actually very minimal, a fraction of a fraction, so about $50 million versus the $33 billion that was going to be spent on policing. But conservatives fought tooth and nail to limit the cost from the final version as they perceived it as a handout. By December 21, 1998, more than 4 years after the enactment of the law, African Americans accounted for over 600,000, of the over 1 million prisoners in both states and federal prisons. In the end, Clinton was a product of the 1960s. But the irony is that when it came to addressing solutions, he seemed to reflect the 60s of Barry Goldwater rather than Lyndon Johnson. He favored policies that mimicked what Republicans were promising, and although he did not go all the way to the right, he did meet them halfway. As Michelle Alexander noted, Clinton forged a quote-unquote new racial caste system since the American public already perceived certain populations as inherently deviant, whether poor, black, whatever, thus not deserving of any resources. So what do we see here? We see the growth of the culture wars and the political divide amongst Americans. There's always pockets, right, where people have conflicts, but it's really in the 1990s where we see this kind of coalition amongst certain populations that define, in their perspective, what is right, what is wrong. Again, gay marriage and drug use and stuff like that, right? Feeling like they're being attacked because of their religious beliefs and so forth. So it's the 1990s where we first begin to see this divide, and today that divide has only grown. I mean, I'm sure most of you out there uh, probably define yourself to some extent through your political spectrum. Well, you can thank the 90s for that, I guess. And then one last point that we see, right, that the 1990s, though, did not start there, as we already addressed, right, in the 1970s, that, globalization is really here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And, these jobs that once paid livable salaries are essentially gone, and they're not going to come back, right? I mean, we shop at Amazon, Walmart, and the only reason why those things became so, somewhat affordable is because they were being produced in other parts of the world. And this only adds friction to our political divide because we assume somebody's going to come in and fix this problem. As you saw, right, our deficit just keeps on going up, and I don't think there's any solutions for that. And then lastly, we see how big businesses benefit from the federal government, right? I mean, Bill Clinton passed this policing bill that you have companies like Geo and other for-profit type companies in this prison industrial complex make hundreds, if not millions, of dollars to imprison populations, and it's profitable, right? Because not only do they get money from the federal government, but they lease out these people to do jobs, so they get money that way too. There's a lot of kind of great studies that address this, and I just want to give you a works cited page. One that I came across fairly recently is this thesis that focuses on African Americans and Bill Clinton. Very fascinating study in case you're interested. So, I'll leave you with that. And, this kind of concludes the 1990s. Have a good day.